This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I help pediatric therapists and educators become better leaders so they can make a bigger impact with their services. With over 15 years of experience supporting school-age kids with diverse learning needs, I'll share up-to-date evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help clinicians, teachers, and aspiring school leaders feel more confident in the way they serve their students and clients. I'll cover a range of topics designed to help you support students' emotional and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood, including how to support language, literacy, executive functioning, as well as how to help IEP teams working together to support kids across the day. Whether you want to learn more effective strategies for your therapy sessions or classroom, be a more influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 141 of the De Facto Leaders podcast. Skeptics of the science of reading claim that the current push for evidence-based reading instruction is just another pendulum swing. Yet if you look at the research, we haven't so much been swinging as much as we've been building, evolving, and expanding on what we know about how we learn to read. Even though the science of reading is trending as I'm recording this episode, there are still many kids without access to quality instruction, and part of that has to do with teacher preparation programs and professional development available to teachers. Those responsible for teaching reading need to know how effective instruction looks, and they also need to be able to spot ineffective practices that actually encourage students to read poorly. That's why I invited Melanie Brethour to the De Facto Leaders podcast to talk about her personal and professional transformation as a special education teacher and literacy advocate. Melanie Brethour is a full-time resource teacher from Montreal, Quebec, Canada, is an advocate for dyslexia awareness and the science of reading. And her deep commitment to this cause was sparked by her son's dyslexia diagnosis at the age of 9, which ignited a personal mission to understand dyslexia and support her and her students. Motivated by her son's journey, Melanie embarked on extensive research and training, achieving Orton-Gillingham Associate Level certification, became a series-structured literacy classroom teacher, and won the NESSE Dyslexia Aware Teacher of the Year Award in 2023. She gives presentations to colleagues, teachers, and parents on dyslexia and the science of reading. Driven to help others facing similar challenges, Melanie established Decoding Dyslexia Quebec, a grassroots movement dedicated to training awareness and providing support. In addition, she launched Soar with Dyslexia on social media, offering resources and information to teachers and parents navigating the complexities of dyslexia and the science of reading. Melanie also volunteers for Dyslexia Canada, lending her support to parents on this difficult journey, and is a board member of the Teachers for Reading Canada, which offers free Orton-Gillingham training to Canadian teachers. In this conversation, we discuss what are the ineffective reading strategies that are taught in teacher education programs, and why do they encourage kids to be poor readers? And can you assume someone has expertise in reading curriculum just because they have an advanced degree? And why do educated people promote methods that don't work? We also talk about common objections to the science of reading, such as things like, but why do some of my students seem to learn reading naturally? And then we wrap up by talking about how teachers and clinicians can make change from the bottom up when top-down changes aren't happening fast enough. Before we get going, I wanted to talk about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program for SLPs who want to create a system for language therapy. The creation of this program was inspired by my doctoral work, which was inspired by my experience as a school SLP, where I was responsible for delivering language interventions to students in the school systems. And I had a similar experience to Melanie where I had to figure out what exactly am I supposed to do to support kids who are struggling to read. So, obviously, if you are in a position where you are providing supplemental support, the question you might be asking yourself is, can I actually make a dent in all of these skills that my students need to build in order to be successful? And my response to that is, effective language therapy really should focus on those language strands of the reading rope. We want to figure out where we can fill in that missing piece and that gap that's going to support all the other things that are happening. And I found that many clinicians need to get clear on what their role is and what they need to do when they have a student in front of them. And once they do that, they can get a lot of clarity on the other things they can do to be a leader on their team. Because no, you can't make a dent in all of those things in just 30 minutes a week if there isn't a robust reading curriculum in place. But you do need to start somewhere in your personal and professional journey. And so what I recommend doing is first coming up with your own personal operating procedures and your system for supporting that language strand of the reading rope. And once you get clear on that and get an idea of the big picture of what needs to be happening for kids when it comes to supporting their literacy skills, you can expand on that and you can do something similar to what Melanie did, where she not only focused on what she could be doing with her students, but she also focused on how she could be a leader on her team and start educating others. And that's where you can start making a dent in some of those other things that need to be happening for kids outside your therapy room. So to learn more about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, if you are a speech pathologist or if you are someone who is involved in those language-based interventions and you want to learn how you can support vocabulary and syntax that is going to help kids to comprehend what they're reading and really support their literacy skills, definitely check out the program. You can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy to learn more. Now, please enjoy this conversation with Melanie Brethour. Today, I am joined by Melanie Brethour, an elementary resource teacher and literacy advocate. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you have a very interesting story and some great background. So I thought we could start off by having you just share your journey and how that's led to the work that you're doing now.
Well, I've been teaching. This is, I believe, my 19th year as an elementary teacher. The last 10 years, I've been a resource teacher from Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And I graduated from McGill University, an excellent school, but I was not really taught the most effective ways based on the body of research called science of reading. I never heard of the term science of reading. And it's really a balanced literacy approach that I was taught. And so I was teaching for, 10 years, teaching students, looking back now, not the most effective ways and I will get into that. And then when I had my son and he started kindergarten, I noticed that he was having great difficulty. He's my firstborn. And here in Quebec, we learn 2 languages. So we also thought maybe it's because he's learning a second language that he's having difficulty. So I saw some red flags, not before kindergarten, because I really did not know, even though I've been teaching for quite some time in special education and as a resource teacher, I just did not know the signs of dyslexia and, how to help him. And we went kind of down the path of, seeking speech and language pathologists to do a mini evaluation. They couldn't diagnose dyslexia, but they did definitely tell us these are some of the deficits he's had. But I knew in kindergarten that he had a learning disability. Mm-hmm. He had, even though I was not maybe teaching him the most effective ways at home, I was still helping him and he was struggling so much. And then at the end of grade 2, we finally got him a diagnosis of dyslexia, where he had a double deficit dyslexia and a mild language disorder and inattentive ADD. So I went on a mission, like an obsessive mission, to learn more about dyslexia, because I really at that time thought I knew enough, but it turns out I didn't. I have kind of been on this journey about, understanding learning disabilities and dyslexia. And then I decided, I took a webinar 101 on dyslexia, and that's when I first heard about Orton Gilliam, Barton, Wilson. I had never learned about the science of reading, and that was when I first heard about it, the body of research into how we learn to read. And it's been around for over 40 years. It's just, unfortunately, I was not taught that in my university program. We really were taught, you just, read, have students read with each other. I was not taught any phonological awareness, phonics. It was just, now that looking back, and it was a while ago. So that was my journey, and I just was obsessive to learn more. And I'm thinking, here I am, an elementary resource teacher in special education, and I did not know this. I'm sure I'm not the only one. And how can I not only help my son Benjamin, but how can I help the students that I've been working with for years? So that's my journey into learning about the science of reading.
Wow. So many different things there we can get into, but it is really interesting how, even at these universities that are known for being good teaching schools, sometimes they just, all the elements aren't there. And what I have found to be really interesting within my state is that some universities, the departments some of them are on board, and then you go to a different department and it's totally different and, not necessarily on board with evidence-based practices. So it's definitely not always consistent, even within universities. And I know that happens, people have different philosophies, even within departments, but, to see that there's sometimes not the alignment, even from the same university, like, there'll be a special education department. I remember once, a lot of those strategies that you talked about, I also, even though I knew about phonological awareness, with my background and with a lot of the things that are considered evidence-based practice, it wasn't called science of reading back then, but it was, the same elements, just called something different. But one department, it's like, I'm talking about these interventions that are being done in this school system or that school system. And I'm thinking that, oh, well, everybody is saying that these are evidence-based and they're effective. And then people in my department, at the same university, they're saying, oh, no, that's not, there's, such, limitations with the research designs that supposedly proved that those, studies were, or those interventions were effective. A lot of cherry picking of, let's just pick the students for this study that are going to make progress so we can show our intervention is effective, even within the same university. And I think part of it for me was that there's a name of a program and it's this brand name. And then you have to really dive into, what does it actually look like? And what are you actually doing with students when they're struggling to read? And you really have to be able to recognize what the strategies are, not just within the brand names, because things get rebranded all the time. And, like, I'm an independent company and I have my own program, but, I'm citing research all the time. So people have to be able to know, if somebody is teaching a program, what effective intervention looks like, or if they're going to support a teacher, they have to know, what's going on, and, how do we know that effective intervention is happening? So I think where we could go now is, like, maybe just going into some of the specific programs that you were doing, or specific strategies, and how you were taught that kids learn to read.
Well, going down this path, I feel like I have way too many tabs because I just love learning. And we're really not big on programs here, especially with ELA. It's often, novel studies, response. having students read, level text. And it wasn't until I learned all about this, like, what is an evidence-based, program versus research-based program. And what I did was really my PD, my professional development. I think that's really key for teachers. I think you can have a fantastic program that I would highly recommend. It's evidence-based or research-based, but we sometimes don't know exactly, if we don't have that background knowledge, I think you can have the best program in your hands, but you won't be able to deliver it, I think, with fidelity and 100% if you don't know what an open syllable is, or the 6 syllable types, for example, or some of the rules that I'm telling you I only learned a few years ago. I'm the first one to admit, I think I was 42 when I learned the cat kite rule or the floss rule. And so I think the teacher's knowledge is number one. So I did Orton Gilliam training with the Orton Gilliam Academy. And that was my first big training. And then I also did with IMSC, which is also Orton Gilliam, where they have more programs. And then I just did a lot of professional development. And I've also learned about UFly just in the last 2 years. So I think for teachers, you can have really a fantastic program, but it's really the background, like your knowledge of how the brain works in terms of learning to read. What are the 5, pillars? The National Reading Panel is a fantastic but very big article or document, I should say. Just learning about structured literacy, I've learned so much, and I have I'm still, learning what's the best intervention for my groups. And sometimes I will try, I'm in the process of trying many different things, but really most of the programs are based on a structured literacy approach. So they often have the same elements that I look into, that I use.
So what were some things what are some of the strategies of the interventions that were taught initially that you were doing, that you thought, like, this is what I do if I need to support kids reading? Like, I guess maybe we could start off with broader principles and then talk about specific strategies. So what are some things that you were told about how kids learn to read that you found out later, weren't accurate?
Well, I think the number one myth for me was that reading was natural, like speaking. I think that was something that, children just learn through osmosis. If you just read to them and expose them to different types of books, comic books. So that was a big myth that I kind of learned about, and that students need to be explicitly taught. There are some, and I've heard different percentages, but about 40% of students will learn to read with very little instruction. And I've seen that firsthand in a grade 1 or kindergarten class where they're reading chapter books, and you're like, how is this student reading so well? It's like, it blows your mind. And then you have another child who's having difficulty remembering their, letter sounds. And so that was a big one for me. The 3 cueing is something that I taught. I reinforced it at home with my son as well. So, looking at, does it look right, sound right? I think there was one more. I even had the poster on the wall. I had those bookmarks where, Skippy the Frog. So if a word is difficult, skip the word. I mean, if the student is having difficulty with 9 out of 10 words, you're going to encourage that child to skip every word. I've seen strategies where the last strategy was to decode, or I remember holding up a book and covering the word and just showing the first letter and saying, look, guess what the word could be. It starts with, there was a picture of a horse, on the page, or look at the picture. So I think for our emergent readers, our struggling readers, this is, I would not do it with any grade, but if we're encouraging that, they are not learning to read. They're not going through that process of orthographic mapping. And that was definitely something. So those were some of the aha moments that I had later on. And I realized I was reinforcing my son's bad habits. I think Emily Hanford has a great quote, like we're teaching these kids to literally read like struggling readers when we're
Yep.
teaching them these
Mm-hmm.
strategies.
Yeah.
And I did that at home. My son was taught that at school, and I reinforced that at home. And I often don't have any, you know, blame for any teacher because I feel like, well, I didn't know this. I just was not taught this. So that's why I'm really focused on spreading awareness about not only dyslexia but struggling students, and how can teachers effectively teach their students. And I'm definitely, the story is not unique in the sense that it often happens that a teacher has a child with dyslexia or they're struggling and then they go down this path, right? But we need every teacher to go down this path regardless if they have a family member that's struggling.
Yeah. I mean, I can, when we're talking about the strategies that are being taught, so there's the cover up the word and just look at the first letter and guess. There's skip it and try to decode it with context. There's look at the picture. I've seen on some of those strategies for kids, ask an adult.
Yes, I've seen
What
that too.
what is that? I mean, so, and again, they sound in other contexts, some of those things are appropriate, but not in this context. Like in other contexts, does it make sense for a child to go ask an adult for help? Of course. You
Mhm.
can say, oh, asking for help, it's self-advocacy. Well, that sounds like it makes sense. Or the context clues one is one where you really do have to understand the like what your brain is doing, and also just distinguish between using context to understand and give additional information about building your vocabulary versus using it to decode a word that you've never seen before, or that where you have no strategy for actually decoding it. Because when you get to the older grades and you have a word and you can decode it, but you're not exactly sure what it means, you can look in the context and actually build your vocabulary that way, but you're still decoding the word and using your phonological knowledge, and maybe you have some background knowledge of that word. And so that's, I think, part of where that context clue and use skip the word and guess came from. Like there's some situations where it is appropriate to do that, but not when you have a child who needs to actually learn how to look at the relevant information. It's,
Mhm.
when you think about teaching kids executive functioning skills for reading, it's like part of executive functioning is knowing where to look for information. And so when you're reading something and you come up against a challenging task, you have to think about, like, where do I go, and like, what do I think about in my head to help me figure this out? And you're literally redirecting them to all this irrelevant information instead of saying, look right here. I mean,
Mhm.
it makes no sense. I mean, it does make sense. That's why people, or it seems like it makes sense, which is why people have been doing it. But so when you were in you're working with students and you're using some of those strategies, like what kind of experiences did you have with your students with those types of strategies? I mean, what would you see happen with kids that you're working with just professionally?
Previously, when I was doing the ineffective strategies or the
Yeah,
positive,
like what was the before and after? How did that look for you?
well, it's hasn't been that long, I have to say, but I often would work with younger students who were just learning to read. I did a lot of guided reading back then, but it included the three cueing, a lot of memorization too, of like the irregular words, and that is not very effective.
That's another
Having
one.
students memorize words. And so I at the time, I really thought, I was doing what I was supposed to do. I was, learning about guided reading and the three cueing, and I had all those bookmarks and the posters on my wall. but the students were still struggling. I often work with the students that were struggling. So I was reinforcing those bad habits that they were
Mm-hmm.
doing. And now looking back, I like cannot believe that I did that. I have
Yeah.
actually a lot of guilt, not only as a parent, but as a teacher, thinking, all those students. I mean, but I'm thinking, there are so many teachers that unfortunately just do not know this, and I don't think it's anybody's fault. It's like you said before, it's like whatever you were taught. If I was taught this and I was teaching at a university, this is what I would be teaching my students, because this is something that I believe in. I believed it worked. So it's really hard for change. I understand that, but we have to look at, any profession you want to improve and learn. And I always say that, the science of reading is the body of research. It's not something that one activity that you do.
Mm-hmm.
Something that I'm doing in my classroom one year might be changed next year because there'll be some new research out there. And so I think we have to be open to that. Can be a little overwhelming for sure, but my advice is anybody going down this path of learning about how the brain learns to read, you maybe just get rid of those ineffective strategies right away, and then slowly incorporate and learn about, how we can bring some of the research into our classroom.
I think what's really interesting is that when I was going in my graduate program, that is around the time that National Reading Panel study came out. And there's been research that's expanded into elements that were both studied in that, in the linear study. And then also there's been components where they've really looked into the morphology component in addition to phonology. So we've added to things that they didn't necessarily get to. And, some of the things that are different now, we've kind of expanded our knowledge from there. But I remember talking to certain people who were very much, I would say that they were emotionally involved and invested, had devoted a lot of time, money. Maybe they were even working in teaching contexts where they were teaching other people these strategies that are ineffective. And I would, share the National Reading Panel study, and the response that I would get is, oh, that's propaganda. Like, I'm curious if that has ever come up for you, or if you've ever experienced that in different discussion groups.
Well, I've heard of, the reading wars all the time, or I've
Yeah.
heard this is a pendulum swing. And
Mm,
yeah, from many people saying, it's just like the reading wars, it's going to be a pendulum swing and we'll go back to, it'll be something new later on. So I do hear that often, even from sometimes people who are in literacy, and I like, higher up in the sense of maybe school boards or things like that. So I'm just sometimes surprised by that, but it's really hard for change, I think, especially when you believe in something fully. If you've done it all your life, it's really difficult to let go of those beliefs you have, right? So I've definitely seen that often, like the pendulum swing. This is just another fad or trend.
well, the thing is that was 2000, the early 2000s when that came out, and it's been expanded upon. So it's not that the pendulum has swung, we've bolstered it, and we know even more about this, more specifics about, we don't necessarily have to go in stages with some of those skills. A lot of the things that I hear from my readers is working on morphology and some of those bigger linguistic units. Is that too hard for kids? Do we have to wait until they master the phonological component? And no, we don't have to do it in stages. Obviously, you need to scaffold and keep that in mind. But that's something that's been added. So it's not like it's, oh, we're doing this and then we changed. It's, we're doing this and we're continuing to build on it. It's
Mhm.
like, layering bricks rather than just, this, we're over here and then we're completely over here. And what I find really interesting is that some of the people who are in favor of, the older methods have a lot of credibility and authority. Maybe they have a doctorate in something. But the thing is that like I have a doctorate, and you always think I'm going to go do this training, and then after I do this training, I'm going to have it figured out. And then you do the training and you're like, wow, this is way more complex than I even realized. And I feel almost less competent now that I know all this other information that I wasn't doing. And I always feel like that with education. So I would say with, people who think people with doctorates have it figured out, and like we don't. So when I see people who have these degrees and it's like, oh, well, they just finished their degree in, such and such, they must know what they're talking about. I'm like, well, maybe they have the other things where they really know a lot of information, but this is a very specific content area that, like you need, especially if you have, maybe a background in leadership. There's a lot of other things that you need to be thinking about besides the specific aspects of the curriculum. And I don't know that people making those decisions, they might be really good with writing grants and getting funding and running teams effectively, and all of these other things that school leaders have to do, the PR, but like, I mean, that's not the same thing as knowing the curriculum. And so I think that sometimes people forget all the different things the people who are making decisions have to think about, that we do need people like you who are in there experiencing what is actually happening to say something about it, because they're not the eyes and the ears in there.
Mm-hmm. It's yes, I think, sometimes I'm thinking I'm not a researcher. I'm an elementary resource teacher, so bringing that research into the classroom is, at times can be difficult. I try and, read as much as possible or listen to a webinar. And I think, yes, it's definitely, I definitely, I'm teaching every day groups of students who are struggling, whether they're dyslexic or not. And, as I said, I completely transformed everything, and I'm going to continue to transform everything if they're based on the research. So I try my best to, share as much information, because it can be overwhelming. It really is. And I think teaching, I can speak for all the teachers at my school and many people I've connected with all over the world. It's really challenging. Students have a lot more, I'm going to say, baggage. I don't know. It's really tough. So, when you're thinking, oh, I have to do this, or they're shoving this down my throat now. Now I have to learn this. It's a lot. It can be a lot. So I always try and just give little bits of information. And, we've seen some really positive change at my school. So there's, lots of talks and, oh, what are you doing? So we have a few teachers this year adopting a few different programs, which is completely new this year. And so I'm really excited when, people from my school, and I have, friends in other school boards, and we're just trying new things in our classroom based on the research.
Yeah. So I know that we talked a little bit about this, and, when we had chatted before, you mentioned, we're not necessarily about programs, and there's not always clear direction coming from the top. So sometimes it has to come from the bottom as well. So I'm curious what your experience has been with the top-down leadership. You've talked about how you had the experience from the university, but what about just in your area, what the guidelines are that are coming down, just with legal mandates and things like that, and just guidance from other entities?
Well, I think it's very different here than from what I hear in the States. Like, we're not mandated. Our curriculum is very open, like broad. So it's a good thing in a sense that I can do what I need to do in my classroom to teach my students to read. Like, we have competencies that students have to reach. I know that at my school, I have a principal and a vice principal who are very supportive of what I'm advocating. So they've, asked me to do presentations at my school. I'm going to be doing a book study with 7 Mighty Moves, just all different types of things to support. Like they see the students struggling. Like I started with, we have a problem. This is the data from our universal screening last year. This is how many students are not proficient readers from grade 1 to grade 6. And there were lots of reds and yellows. I was using Acadians last year and for the first time. Before that, I was doing PM benchmarks, which was really, students would look at the picture and, we would be probably cueing them, all that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought I'd say this is the problem. And then we had a big meeting, like a staff meeting at my school, and we were going to try different, reading strategies, and everybody was taking little types of webinars or workshops that I recommended. So it's been great. And people at my school board, especially the special education consultants, know that I'm very passionate about this as well.
Mm-hmm.
And they've met with me, and I think there's going to be some change. I'm really hoping. We're right next to Ontario, the other province, and they have changed everything about their curriculum based on the right to read inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been a huge change for them. And I'm assuming that somebody who's at the ministry level knows what's going on in the province next to us. So I'm really hopeful that things are going to change. And it seems to be, I don't know, maybe it's because I'm in my own little science of reading world where it seems like everybody talks about it, but
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
you know,
Uh-huh.
but there seems to be, I think, a movement, a change to look at the research into how we learn to read.
I love
So
that, there's a tangible way that you can go and talk to your administration. Do you think that they had any idea, like if you wouldn't have said something in that moment, like what would have happened? Would they have had any idea that
I
there was anything wrong?
I don't think so. I mean, we always do, I'm sure like most places, and we have ministry exams at the end of the year for grade 6, and we have that data. Is it a universal screener? No, but they know the proficiency rates to some extent. So I think they knew that, students were struggling, but I think it was really eye-opening when I showed them, that pie of the percentage of students that are struggling at our school. And so I don't think they knew. I think they're the first ones to admit, because I didn't know this. And I often think, if it wasn't for my son, would I be talking to you today? Would I
Yeah.
be, would I be like obsessed with this? I really often think that. I often say, it's been a journey with him. It's been challenging. It's been a lot. And I don't want to get too emotional, because it really has been hard watching, when you have a child struggle, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm a teacher. So I'm like, I want my kid to love school, but he doesn't really love it that much.
Yeah.
And
I wanted to take a quick break here to talk about Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps speech pathologists and other language interventionists support that language strand of the reading rope. I hope that so far from listening to this conversation, you can take away the fact that explicit instruction is extremely important. And when it comes to building language and vocabulary skills, there are a lot of kids who are able to learn things implicitly. But for many students, especially the ones that end up on your caseload, they do need explicit instruction in some of those foundational language skills in order to support high-level comprehension. And I show you how to do this in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. I was inspired to create this program because of my experience as a school SLP, where I felt like I did not have a clear system and a framework that would help me to make the biggest impact that I could in just 30 to 40 minutes a week with my students. And the way to do that is to strategically focus on high leverage skills that build the foundational knowledge that kids need to support all those other skills that they need to learn, such as high-level comprehension strategies, being able to understand full paragraphs and understand the gist of what they're reading. they won't be able to do that if they struggle to comprehend at the word and sentence level. So I give you a framework for doing that efficiently and effectively in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. Again, you can learn more about the program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. What happens? Because sometimes administrators, and it depends on the state, here that a lot of times if students aren't meeting certain benchmarks, then administrators, they get a lot of pressure from the school boards. And so, I mean, what is that like by you?
It's very different. I'm always fascinated how the states, and every state is different, but from the people that I connected with that teach in the state and what I've heard. So we don't have those types of mandates.
Mm-hmm.
You have to use this program, or we're adopting this program, or your students are not reaching benchmarks. Maybe you get a slap on your wrist, but we don't have anything like that really. So it's quite different.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's a reason that this is happening too.
Yeah.
I'm not too sure, but it's very different.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, I think the argument sometimes is that, oh, if you go too scripted with the curriculum, you're taking away people's freedom and creativity. And yeah, you can take it too far, but I mean, at least around, in Illinois, the state that I'm in, and a lot of the other states, there's a big emphasis on the scaling and alignment across the grade level, and then also the alignment from one grade level to another. And there is that's where a lot of the administrators and curriculum directors are focused. So I know that sometimes that can be frustrating for people who feel like some of their autonomy is taken away. And I do think that there's probably some kind of a middle ground there, because you see the other way around, where if you don't have any guidelines, then, then it's kind of a free for all, or people just don't feel supported that way either, because they don't like all the decisions being left up to you it's like, it sounds freeing, but sometimes it's actually a burden to have to come up with all these decisions without some guidance and support.
100%. I think there needs to be a balance, I'm going to say, which is probably not what we want to say today, but I agree, because I think I have a lot of freedom. I mean, we still have to obviously, teach the curriculum, but it's, at least I can speak for our ELA curriculum, where there's no program that's recommended. You can kind of, and that was the thing, I would be big borrowing and stealing to make a lesson for the longest time. And then when I did my Orton Gilliam training, it was, a lot of preparation, finding all these different resources to make a lesson. And then when I had, for the first time UFly, my mind was blown, because I was like, oh my gosh, I have everything that I need.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to reinvent the wheel. And at the same time, for anybody who doesn't have a background, it's kind of like, as you go, you're learning as well. So, so I just find, we need like a kind of middle ground in terms of that. And I think especially when teachers are not aware of what to do or how to teach students to become proficient readers, or as many students in their classroom as possible.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing too is, if you don't know how it works, then you have your curriculum, but how do you differentiate for a student who maybe needs to be pushed a little bit more, or needs it to be taught more explicitly? And, that's the differentiation becomes really difficult if you don't really have this in-depth understanding of the material. And it's interesting, because I know you mentioned that your son went to a speech pathologist, and I get questions from SLPs all the time, like, can I actually make a dent in these, my student needs support in literacy, they need support in vocabulary, and they need support in language. And you absolutely can, but it's a service that, it's a special education service, and special education services should be delivered on top of an already robust curriculum. So it's, there's no, you can't put the icing on the cake without the cake there, and so I think that is part of, people in those special education roles where you're supplemental, but you can really be a strong advocate for things to be happening in the curriculum as well. Because how do you think about, we would say here, tier 3 special education, like you can't think about tier 3 without thinking about tiers 1 and 2, which, are in the classrooms.
Exactly. I think that's the thing we need to, there's a few quotes out there. I can't remember them exactly, but if there's so many students that are struggling in a school or a classroom, I can't take everybody.
Yeah.
There's only so many students that I can work with. So I think that's what the core classroom instruction needs to be solid. Like you said, like that cake or that house, that foundation.
Yeah.
And then I'm actually hoping that I will see less and less students, over the years, because there's just right now there's too many. And I know that that's happening, in the States and around the world. So I think that's
Yeah.
the key is we got to get all teachers in every tier to be knowledgeable about how to reach all students based on the research and get rid of those ineffective, we call them reading strategies, but I can't even believe they were reading strategies.
Yeah, I
With
know.
students. So I think that's it. And if you can work with an SLP, I have the SLP this year who, often it's more articulation, I find, at my school, but they're also, doing other pieces as well for literacy. So.
Yeah, it is different in Canada. I've had some SLPs go through some of my programs who are in Canada, and sometimes they're like, I know how you do it in the States, but here's how this looks here. And it is a lot. I know that I had one person who she wasn't able to pull kids out for therapy. She had to go in and do it in the classroom. And it was like, how do I customize what you're doing to this model that I'm supposed to be using here? And, it's not, it wasn't ideal, but there was a way that we could do it. Again, if you have a solid understanding of the material and the framework, you can make adjustments when you have a less than ideal situation. And I think too, part of it is that, the special education teacher role or speech pathologist or other related service providers on the team that are providing different supports, I think their role can look a little different, where you're not always pulling kids out. Sometimes you're going into a classroom, sometimes you're coaching teachers, and not saying that we're getting rid of the pulling kids out, because sometimes that is what's necessary, but just using a variety of things so that it's not the only thing that you're using. So you've mentioned some specific things you did that were very effective in like you becoming this leader in your building. So like what other things would you recommend to people who are on a team, they've had a similar experience to you where they were taught this strategy, or they know that a lot of people are using these strategies and a lot of kids are not making progress and something needs to change? So like what tangible things can people start to do if they're in that situation and they want to do something similar to what you've been able to do?
Well, I think, and I've heard, I think Stephanie Stoller wrote something like this. You can't be telling people like what you're doing is completely wrong. I think you're going to push them against the wall,
Right.
So I think little baby steps of just, so that's what I did, like I'm learning about the research. There's just, I have an updated bookmark or a class poster. Instead of having students, guess at the picture and then, kind of go down that road. Because for me, the 3 cueing is like number one that I often say. If there's one thing that you can do today, it's that, don't encourage students to guess at a word. And I often share that quote, this is how we're, teaching, this is what struggling readers actually do. My son would guess all the time and then I was reinforcing it. And then I'm like, it boggles my mind that that's something that I thought was a reading strategy. Memorizing words as well. We need to have students, sound out and decode,
Mm-hmm.
have that orthographic processing where, their attention to each, how many sounds are in a word, and then what is the grapheme that represents that sound, and just playing and manipulating with the sound structure of language, I think is key. Most of the students I have definitely a phonological deficit or just have not played with language early on. And
Mm-hmm.
so that's something that I often do. And most of the lessons or programs out there that are research based or evidence based usually have that, like those phonological drills and, using graphemes to represent those sounds. And so those are just some of the pieces that I've kind of said, what can you do tomorrow? Using decodable text, but not for older students. I always think of them as training wheels
Mm-hmm.
for those students, for those emergent readers, for those struggling readers, and using a scope and sequence, explicit, I do, we do, you do,
Mm-hmm.
are all types of different strategies. So those are just a few that I would probably say, please stop or start looking into, what does explicit instruction look like? What is the scope and sequence? I'm not going to introduce digraphs to my students before, making sure that they know their short vowels and their consonants.
Mm-hmm.
Those are just a few.
Are there things about, and I'm thinking of guided reading because I know that's done a lot, where there are certain aspects of it where there's obviously things if you're teaching kids to guess words that, that's not something that's going to be helpful to them. Are there pieces of it that could be helpful for kids who are beyond and ready to work on comprehension, or things about that format that we can keep and apply for the kids who are ready and who have those skills and they are ready to move on to more of the, focusing on the comprehension?
I think so. I think, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely things that we're doing that are actually, great. We're teaching students to read, but there's definitely, we're not reaching all of our students in our classroom. Those students who are just pick up reading very easily. And yes, you're not going to, anybody who's a proficient reader or just keep on proving, you're not going to give them a decodable text or a controlled text. I think guided reading can work for those students that you are going to work on, background knowledge and
Mm-hmm.
morphology and getting into like more complex multisyllabic words, for example. But I think for me, when I was doing guided reading, I was taking the weakest students since I work with them and giving them leveled readers and, saying that this is the level that you're at. We're going to try and get to the next level. But yet most of the words in the story, they could not read or even sound out. And just using those the three cueing was something that was very something that I did a lot. These are the irregular words that we're reading, and we have to memorize them. English doesn't make sense, and so I think there's definitely some things that I still think people are doing guided reading. I'm just saying that there's better, more effective ways to work with your small groups, especially those students who are struggling.
Yeah. What is a quick synopsis of how a guided reading lesson would look like if you kind of just walk somebody through it at a high level?
Well, I would get my leveled reader. This is the group that they're in, level A, for example, or level B,
Mm-hmm.
based on, I did a PM benchmark. I see that they're at this level. And then I would have my group, I give them a book, and then we would do the round robin where each
Mm-hmm.
student would read. And, that was something that, and there's, not a lot of great evidence, I guess, or research out there of how effective round robin is.
Mm-hmm.
When you think about it, you have 6 students or 5 students, and each student is reading. They're not reading a lot. Most of the times, I had to get them back on track, or you
Mm-hmm.
lost your place. And so that's how I did guided reading back then. And then we would, practice memorizing those sight words in the text as well. And then ask, some comprehension questions at the end, which is not a bad thing, but
Right. Yeah.
we definitely have to, that's the whole point of reading, is the reading comprehension and the simple view. And that's our end goal. So that's what I did, but I noticed that many students were struggling. They would obviously look at the picture because that is something that I encouraged or guess based on the
Hmm.
first. So there wasn't really a lot of, I'm sure if I filmed myself back then versus now, it's completely different. I was just not teaching them to, I don't even know if I said sound it out or try and decode. I hope I did. But
Hmm.
it's definitely um, wasn't the most effective way to teach the struggling students how to read.
Yeah. So with all those other strategies, is that something where people are kind of just pulling in, you're doing this guided reading lesson and this student is struggling on this word, and then you're just kind of pulling one of those strategies out as you see it's appropriate and when students are not
Exactly.
getting the word.
Yeah, or I would help them right away. There was no like
Hmm.
struggling. Like, okay, this word is. They didn't even maybe they said I don't know how to read that, and I would just say the word or
Hmm.
look at the picture and encourage all those ineffective reading habits.
Is that something that is a feature of guided reading, is those cueing strategies, or is it just kind of like figure out how to help students as you go with that first general format that you said?
Well, for me, there was a book. I don't know if I want to mention the book, but
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have to mention names, but
there's a book that is a very popular book, and in it, it encourages those strategies. So
okay.
that was the book that I used. I I really considered myself a reading guided reading guru back then. I really had it down packed, I felt at the time. And so I did that. And I was also, just was taught those are the ways to teach students how to read.
Hmm. I ask because I know that there is whenever there's something like that, here's the protocol, here's how we do it. And then I know that sometimes as it gets spread around and implemented different ways, sometimes people put their own spin on it or they layer in other strategies. So I'm just curious if that's typically how you have seen people do it, with is just that this is something that is actually encouraged within this format.
Yes, the one book that I'm thinking of definitely encouraged that. And I actually looked at it, I still have it. I wanted to see it, and it did encourage a lot of those strategies that are just not effective. So,
Hmm. So if we do before and after, what would a reading group look like for you now?
well, right now it would be it's like a 180. I'm sometimes when people say, "Oh, like, is there really a big difference?" It's a
Hmm.
huge difference. I think it's also, I have done a lot of professional development from many different types of, webinars, programs, and just it's completely different. So I have a scope and sequence now. I do universal screeners first, and then to see which students are struggling, and then I do diagnostics to figure out what are the skills that they're missing. And then I group my students not based on a level anymore,
Hmm.
of level B or C or D, because if you look at those books from level
Yeah.
A to level F, they're I don't know how. I think it's based on how many words sometimes. I looked into it not that long ago, and there's just no rhyme and reason for the level books, at least the ones that I looked at.
Yeah, and it doesn't give you a lot of descriptive information. I mean, I
No.
used to actually in one of my programs where I'm like, here's, classroom data. I did have something where I'm like, okay, part of it is reading level, and I would still write that down. I mean, you can write it down. It's not really telling you a lot though. Like you can document it on your report, but you probably should have a lot of other information if you want to actually know what to do. Anyway,
Exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
no, I would group my students in my guided reading based on the level of book that they could read. And then, so with my groups now, I do after my diagnostics, figuring out, do they know their short vowels? Are they having difficulty with their long vowels? Do they know their consonants? I base my groups on that. And
Mm-hmm.
so then I look at, what kind of scope and sequence are they at? Are they at short vowels? And I follow, there's so many different scopes and sequences out there, but most of them I find are quite similar. And so it's really explicit. There's no just saying, okay, this is the okay, I'm going to teach you the letter C today, and it makes the k sound. And that was pretty much it. It was, let's practice reading a little bit, some words with the k sound, and they would ask probably like, when do I use the C or K or CK? And I would not be able to answer that 10 years ago. I would just say English is crazy, doesn't make sense. And that was it. And so it's really explicit. Like now it's like, okay, we use a C, there's the cat kite rule. We watch, videos. It's very multi-sensory as well approach. We do like, I would start my lesson with phonological drills just for like 1 minute where we're actually manipulating, playing with the sound structure of language, say cupcake, now say cupcake, but not cup, and building on, from very basic to more complex. Then I would go into, a visual drill where I'm only introducing the concepts that, I'm teaching, and we move very slowly. So just, showing a card here, but, what sound does it make? And this is the A, it makes an A sound. Going into really specifics, I even have a sound wall, which I know there's not a lot of research on sound walls right now, but I just feel that this is something that I find it takes it to the next level of, we have a lot of students with articulation issues. So I even have mirrors in my classroom for students to look at so we can see how, I mean, now with, thank goodness, no more masks, but, this is, I have often kids will walk into my room and why do you have a mouse on your wall? And, so we unlock the sound that we're learning, and it's just taking it to the next level and really modeling like I do, we do, you do. We do auditory drills as well, where I say the sound and they have to, in some type of multi-sensory format, write the letter that represents that sound using a controlled text or a decodable text only based on the concepts that I've taught. So they're practicing that. We do word work in U Fly also, where they're manipulating and playing with the sound structure of language, but based only on our scope and sequence. So it's really, there is a lesson and I follow it to a T with fidelity. I'm trying even to do a better job this year. And so that's how it's completely different. It's just, there's no guessing anymore of, or saying that this doesn't make sense. I'm probably missing a few components of my lesson plan,
so it sounds like a lot of those things that you're saying are at the linguistic unit level. There's sounds, there's word parts, there is the word level. And then do you do sentence level and paragraph level work too? Is that part of the lesson eventually?
Sentence level, yes. So we're practicing dictation as well. So they're practicing, whatever the concept we're working on. I do have them do some dictation of words and sentences as well. I try and, because we're learning 2 languages, sometimes my students have 3 languages. In the past, I would take for granted that they knew what a simple word was. And then they would say, what does that mean, miss? And I'm in my head going, okay, you don't know what this word means, then you don't know almost every other word that I'm saying right now.
Yeah.
So I also, vocabulary is something that I'm learning a lot about too, and background knowledge. And so that is something that every time we're writing a word, we talk about that word. What does that word, mean? Could it mean many different things? So it's just explicitly teaching, I mean, everything, the vocabulary, the scope and sequence, is it voiced on, voiced off? I never did any of this. So it is completely different than what I taught, just maybe 5-6 years ago.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful to just even walk through the differences in lessons, because people are talking about these programs and these broader concepts. And I see that even in the clinical world where it's, oh, does this program work? Or, this isn't research based. And my question is always, well, walk me through what you're actually doing, because sometimes if there is something newer where there might be some case study evidence for something, maybe there's a piece of that intervention that, has some research to support it and we can build on it. Or maybe once you actually do that, you realize, oh, this is something that has been proven to be ineffective. So I think a lot of times just even getting down to the specifics of what's happening is really helpful for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was that person. I like, well, what does effective instruction look like? I had no clue until, I took, a few different courses and my eyes were like, it's almost like, like an aha moment of going, okay, this is what it looks like. And there's so much, information out there, which is wonderful. Can be a little overwhelming, as I mentioned before, but there's some fantastic webinars and workshops that anybody can take. It's time, it's time for teachers
Yeah.
to learn.
Well, I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your story, because I do think there's a lot of people who are very frustrated, who feel like they can't, it's not coming from the top, so they're not able to do anything about it. And, you're showing that you've been able to really make some change and kind of emerge as somebody in a leadership role in your building, just from all the work that you've done and your own things that you've gone through and what you've learned. So I think that is really encouraging and inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you.
So where can people go to connect with you and learn about just how they can learn some of the things that you've been able to learn, or even just, I know you have some side projects that you're working on in the advocacy space.
Yes, so I started a Decoding Dyslexia Quebec. It's a grassroots movement that was started in the States. There's one in every state. I believe there's in 7 provinces now. And I know in the States, some of them are like, changing legislation, like doing amazing, incredible things that I hope to do one day. But right now I can only manage a Facebook page. But it was really because, again, I thought, if I don't know this, how are parents going to be able to navigate this journey of helping their child? So I started a Facebook page sharing resources and information. And I also I am on, social media. I do think it's a positive thing. I've met some incredible people like you, which is wonderful. But I do have an Instagram page called Soar with Dyslexia. It's the play on word, science of reading and dyslexia. And I really, the main goal of it is just to spread awareness about how to help struggling students and, parents and teachers. So I often post videos, I often post quotes about the science of reading and literacy. I try and put practical ideas too. It's not always related to, literacy, like, I like how to organize your student materials, things like that. But most of it, it's about spreading awareness, and I love sharing resources. I think I am a resource teacher, and I love sharing resources. Most of them are always free, because I just find as teachers, I know I have a lot of Amazon boxes coming to my house almost daily, and I spend a lot of my own money on resources and materials, and I just want to share as much as possible with people.
So it's for parents or professionals, both of them?
Yes, parents and teachers, I think, are my biggest following. And so, like the other day, I just shared Misconception Mondays about, dyslexia, and sharing, a kind of a checklist for, parents or teachers of, the different stages and what are the signs of dyslexia in preschool and grade 1 and things like that. So that's it.
Well, I think the other members of the team, the clinicians, obviously, that are responsible for providing the supplemental interventions, in addition to the special ed teachers. I know, the special ed teacher is part of that team, but also the people making the decisions and the administrators. I think they need to hear this too. So I hope that you get some more people following your pages after this interview.
Yes, I do actually have a lot of SLPs that follow me too, so it's great. But yeah, it's just to spread more awareness, as I mentioned.
Well, thank you so much for sharing and for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all the places that you can go to connect with Melanie. And also, if you want to learn strategies that can support the language strand of the reading rope that can help you to create an effective language therapy system, definitely check out Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. As always, it helps me so much if you share this episode with your friends and your colleagues, especially with this episode if you have colleagues who need to learn about effective reading practices and you want to spread the word. This is just such important information that needs to be out there. So definitely share this with your friends and also rate and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you have a suggestion for a guest, or if you would like to be a guest on the show, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.